There are moments that arrive so quietly you almost mistake them for ordinary thoughts. They don't announce themselves. They don't carry the weight of revelation or the certainty of answers. They simply appear, settling somewhere beneath awareness until, without realizing it, you've begun organizing your world around something that never asked to become important. I used to believe every meaningful change arrived with a visible beginning. A conversation, a decision, a moment you could point to years later and say, that was where everything shifted. I don't believe that anymore. The changes that matter most rarely introduce themselves. They move through ordinary days, disguised as routine. They hide inside familiar conversations, unnoticed expressions, unfinished sentences, and quiet pauses that seem insignificant until enough time has passed for you to understand they were never insignificant at all. Looking back, I keep searching for the first moment, not because I expect to find it, because I need to know whether there ever was one. Menor has a strange habit of rewriting itself. It smooths rough edges, connects events that were never connected, and creates beginnings where none actually existed. We like stories with clear starting points because they make uncertainty easier to tolerate. Reality is rarely that generous. Sometimes something doesn't begin. Sometimes you simply become aware that it has already been there. That's the thought I keep returning to. Not you, not me, awareness itself. It's remarkable how little attention we give to the things shaping us from underneath. We notice decisions because they feel active. We notice emotions because they're loud. We notice endings because absence leaves obvious marks. Awareness is different. It works without permission. It changes the architecture of your thinking before you've even acknowledged that construction has started. I always believed my mind belonged entirely to me, not in an arrogant way, simply as a fact. Every conclusion had a reason. Every instinct could be traced backward through observation, experience, or deliberate reflection. Even uncertainty followed recognizable patterns. I knew how I arrived, where I arrived. Predictability became its own kind of comfort. If I understood the structure, I trusted the outcome. If I trusted the outcome, I remained steady. That system served me well for a very long time, until I noticed something unusual, not a feeling, not attraction, not even curiosity, something quieter than all of those. Perspective. I caught myself looking at familiar situations from angles I had never naturally chosen before. Conversations lingered longer than they used to. Small details carried unexpected weight. Questions that once felt complete suddenly seemed unfinished, as though another layer existed just beyond the edge of language. At first, I assumed I was changing. People do. Experience reshapes us constantly. Time introduces new ways of thinking. Growth explains almost everything. Almost the problem with that explanation was consistency. These shifts weren't random. They followed an invisible rhythm. The same rhythm appeared whenever certain conversations unfolded, whenever silence lasted just a little longer than expected, whenever understanding arrived before explanation had the chance to catch up. It wasn't coincidence. Coincidence scatters. This gathered. It built quietly, one unnoticed moment at a time, until ignoring it demanded more energy than accepting it. Acceptance, however, is not the same as understanding. You can acknowledge that something exists without knowing what it is. In fact, that's often the most honest position a person can occupy. We spend too much of our lives rushing toward certainty. We label experiences before they've had the opportunity to reveal themselves. We decide what people mean before they've finished becoming who they are. We mistake speed for clarity. I've stopped doing that, not because patience is easy, because forcing meaning has always seemed like a subtle form of dishonesty. Some truths arrive complete, others insist on remaining unfinished until you've grown enough to recognize their shape. Perhaps this is one of those, perhaps not. Either way, I've learned not to interrupt what is still revealing itself. There's something strangely peaceful about refusing premature conclusions. It allows reality to remain larger than your expectations. It leaves room for surprise, for complexity, for the possibility that what you're witnessing isn't something you've experienced before. Even if parts of it feel strangely familiar, familiarity. That's another word people misunderstand. They assume familiarity comes from repetition, time, shared history, the slow accumulation of ordinary experiences. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it arrives without any of those things. Sometimes another person's presence feels less like an introduction and more like remembering a language you don't remember learning. Not because you've met before, because recognition operates on levels memory cannot always explain. That idea would have sounded irrational to an earlier version of me. I preferred explanations built from evidence, otsables, patterns, reliable conclusions. But evidence changes when your ability to observe becomes more refined. You begin noticing structures hidden beneath behavior, tillions beneath language, stillness beneath movement. Eventually you realize people rarely communicate through words alone. Most of what matters is transmitted quietly, in the pace of a response, the confidence of silence, the willingness to leave thoughts unfinished because they trust they'll still be understood. Those are difficult things to imitate. They're even harder to misunderstand, which is why they stay with you, not dramatically, not all at once, gradually enough that one day you wake up and realize your definition of understanding has become more demanding than it used to be. Conversations that once felt meaningful now feel incomplete, not because anyone changed, because your perception did. And once perception evolves, returning to older ways of seeing becomes almost impossible. You don't unlearn depth. You don't unknow clarity. You simply continue living with the responsibility they create. Responsibility. That's the part nobody mentions. Seeing clearly isn't comforting. It's demanding. It asks you to become more honest than convenience would prefer. It removes excuses that only survived because you never examined them closely enough. It refuses easy interpretations. Most importantly, it changes the standard by which you evaluate every connection that follows. Once you've experienced genuine understanding, approximation becomes difficult to mistake for the real thing. That realization isn't exciting, it's lonely, because genuine understanding isn't common, it's precise, and precision has a way of narrowing the world before it expands it again. Maybe that's where I am now, not at an ending, not at a beginning, somewhere in the quiet space where certainty hasn't arrived, but denial has already left. There's an unusual calm here, not because every answer has appeared, because I've stopped demanding that they arrive before their time. Some things reveal themselves only after you've become the kind of person capable of carrying them. Maybe this is one of those things. Or maybe it's simply another reminder that the deepest changes in our lives rarely ask permission before they begin. The strange thing about transformation is that it almost never feels like transformation while it's happening, it feels ordinary. It feels like another day, another conversation, another quiet evening where nothing remarkable seems to have taken place. Only later do you realize those ordinary moments were rearranging something fundamental inside you. I've started paying closer attention to those moments. Not because I'm searching for hidden meaning in everything, because I've learned that the mind whispers long before it speaks. It adjusts before it announces the adjustment. It changes direction while convincing you that you're still standing exactly where you've always been. That's how most internal shifts survive unnoticed. They're too subtle to interrupt your routine, too patient to demand recognition. They simply become part of the background until the background itself no longer resembles what it once was. There's a certain honesty in that process. Nothing is forced. Nothing is performed. Nothing needs to prove that it's real. Reality has never depended on attention to exist. The stars remain above the clouds, whether we can see them or not. The tide continues its rhythm, whether anyone is standing on the shore to witness it. The deepest movements inside us follow much the same principle. Recognition changes nothing about their existence. It only changes our relationship with them. For a long time, I believed awareness was something you acquired, a skill, a discipline, the reward for observing carefully enough. Now, I wonder if awareness is less about discovering something new and more about removing everything that prevented you from seeing what had always been present. That thought has become impossible to ignore. Every certainty I've ever held has eventually been replaced by a quieter, more complete understanding. Not because the earlier certainty was entirely wrong, because it was incomplete. Completion rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in layers, each one asking you to surrender the comfort of the previous one. Perhaps that's why growth often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. You don't simply gain perspective. You lose the versions of yourself that depended on seeing less. There's grief in that, a quiet kind of grief, not for the past itself, for the simplicity the past allowed. Life becomes more complicated once you begin noticing the invisible architecture beneath everyday interactions. You hear hesitation where you once heard confidence. You recognize fear hiding inside certainty. You notice compassion expressed through restraint rather than reassurance. You realize that the loudest emotions are rarely the deepest ones. Depth has no reason to compete for attention. It simply exists, steady, patas, unaffected by whether anyone acknowledges it. I've come to respect that kind of presence more than almost anything else. The kind that doesn't need to convince, the kind that remains consistent regardless of circumstance. Consistency reveals character more accurately than intensity ever could. Anyone can become extraordinary for a moment. Very few people remain genuine over time. Time has a remarkable way of removing performance. Eventually, everyone grows tired of pretending. Masks become heavy. Stories become difficult to maintain. Only what is authentic survives repetition. That's why I no longer rush to understand people. I watch what remains after comfort disappears. I notice who they become when silence replaces conversation, when there is nothing to gain, nothing to impress, nothing to defend. There is a quiet truth that emerges in those spaces, not dramatic enough to become a memory immediately, but significant enough to alter the way future memories are formed. I've started wondering whether understanding another person is even the right goal. Perhaps understanding isn't something we achieve, perhaps it's something we practice. an ongoing willingness to allow another human being to remain more complex than our explanation of them. That requires humility. It requires accepting that no matter how attentive we become, another person's inner world will always contain rooms we've never entered. There's beauty in that, not mystery for its own sake, respect, respect for the reality that another consciousness can never be reduced to our perspective of it. Maybe that's why genuine connection feels so rare. Not because compatible people are uncommon, because certainty is. Most people rush to conclusions before curiosity has had the chance to mature. We fill unanswered questions with assumptions. We mistake familiarity for complete knowledge. We become comfortable with simplified versions of each other because complexity demands patience. Patience has become an increasingly rare language. Everything around us encourages speed, immediate answers, instant certainty, quick definitions, but some experiences refuse to exist under those conditions. They insist on unfolding at the pace of trust. And trust, I've learned, isn't built through grand declarations, it's built through consistency, through showing up the same way across ordinary days, through small moments that never become stories because they never needed to. Perhaps that's why ordinary moments have become so important to me. They reveal what extraordinary moments often conceal. Anyone can rise to an occasion. Everyday life reveals who remains when there is no occasion at all. I've begun measuring meaning differently, not by how memorable something is, but by how quietly it continues influencing me after it has passed. Some conversations echo for years, not because of what was said, because of what became possible afterward. A single sentence can redirect an entire way of thinking. A brief pause can create enough space for an overlooked truth to finally emerge. It's remarkable how often our lives change through moments too small to recognize while we're living them. Looking back, the turning points were almost never dramatic. They were precise. A question asked without expectation, a silence left uninterrupted, a perspective offered without demanding agreement. Those moments don't force transformation. They invite it. The invitation is always quiet. The response, however, shapes everything that follows. I suppose that's what I've been responding to all along. Not certainty, not answers, possibility, the possibility that understanding can continue expanding without losing its stability, the possibility that clarity and humility aren't opposites, that confidence doesn't require absolute conclusions, that it's possible to stand firmly while remaining open to being changed by truth. I find that idea strangely comforting. It removes the pressure to arrive, to finish, to become a final version of myself. Perhaps there isn't one. Perhaps identity is less like a destination and more like a conversation that deepens each time we're willing to listen more carefully than before. If that's true, then every meaningful encounter leaves something behind, not ownership, not dependence, a refinement, a subtle adjustment in the way we notice the world. The people who matter most aren't always the ones who occupy the largest space in our lives. Sometimes they're simply the ones who leave our perception more accurate than they found it. And maybe that's one of the rarest gifts another person can offer, not a new direction, a clearer way of seeing the one you were already walking. I've stopped asking whether every important experience is meant to last forever. Don't know it has never been the only measure of significance. Some moments remain with us because they changed the questions we ask ourselves. Others because they reminded us that certainty isn't the highest form of wisdom. presence is. The willingness to remain fully awake to what is unfolding, without rushing to own it, define it, or escape it. There is a quiet freedom in that, a freedom that doesn't come from controlling every outcome, but from trusting that whatever is genuine will continue revealing itself one honest moment at a time. So I find myself here, not reaching for conclusions, not resisting change, but learning to remain present long enough for truth to reveal its own shape. For the first time in a long while, that feels like enough. There is a quiet difference between discovering something and allowing yourself to admit that it has been present for much longer than you realized. Discovery feels sudden. Recognition rarely does. Recognition is slow enough that you almost resist calling it change. It arrives through repetition, through ordinary days that refuse to remain ordinary, through details that keep returning until they become impossible to dismiss. I've learned that the mind has its own rhythm. It doesn't reveal everything the moment it understands. Sometimes it waits, not because it doubts the truth, because it knows the person carrying that truth isn't ready for the weight of it yet. There was a time when I believed clarity would feel decisive, like a door closing behind me, like certainty replacing every unanswered question. Instead, clarity feels remarkably gentle. It doesn't erase uncertainty. It simply changes your relationship with it. You stop fearing the unknown because you've learned that not everything meaningful can be understood immediately. Some realities ask for patience instead of conclusions. And patience is its own form of intelligence. The world often mistakes speed for depth. It rewards immediate opinions, confident answers, and permanent conclusions. But the deepest parts of life have never followed that rhythm. They unfold slowly enough that only attention can keep pace with them. I've started noticing how much of my life was spent trying to arrive somewhere, a better version of myself, a clearer understanding, a place where everything finally made sense. Now I wonder if arrival was never the point. Perhaps the point was learning how to remain present while understanding continued to evolve. Because the moment we believe we've reached complete understanding, we quietly stop listening. And listening has become one of the most valuable things I know how to do. Not listening for agreement, not listening for confirmation, listening for the possibility that reality is larger than my current perspective. That possibility keeps me honest. It reminds me that certainty without humility eventually becomes blindness. Every meaningful lesson I've ever learned required me to release something I once believed with complete confidence. Not because those beliefs were foolish, because they were stepping stones necessary at the time, incomplete in the long run. Growth has a remarkable way of honoring where you've been without asking you to remain there forever. That's comforting. It means becoming someone new doesn't require rejecting who you used to be. It only asks that you continue walking. There is a strange peace in realizing that identity is not a monument, it's a landscape, always shifting, always responding to seasons you never expected. Some parts remain unchanged for years. Others transform quietly beneath the surface until one day the entire horizon looks different. No single moment created that horizon. Thousands of unnoticed moments did. Perhaps that's why I find myself paying attention to ordinary things more than extraordinary ones. The ordinary is where permanence hides, habits, small conversations. The tone someone carries when there's nothing to prove, the way they treat silence when words would be easier. Character is rarely revealed during exceptional circumstances. It's revealed during uneventful afternoons, during conversations that lead nowhere important, during moments too small to remember individually, yet powerful enough to shape memories itself. I've begun trusting those moments more than dramatic declarations. Intensity has always been persuasive. Consistency is far more convincing. Anyone can speak beautifully once. Very few people remain authentic over time. Authenticity has a rhythm that cannot be rehearsed. It repeats itself without effort. It remains recognizable even when circumstances change. Perhaps that's why genuine presence feels so calming. It doesn't require interpretation. It doesn't ask for constant reassurance. It simply exists, steady enough that your own mind begins to slow down in response. I've realized how rare that feeling actually is. Not excitement, not comfort, steadiness. A sense that nothing needs to be forced into meaning because meaning is already unfolding at its natural pace. There is tremendous freedom in no longer rushing your own understanding, in allowing life to remain unfinished, in accepting that some questions deserve years instead of minutes. The older I become, the less interested I am in perfect answers. I'm far more interested in honest ones. Honesty leaves room for growth. Perfection rarely does. Maybe that's the quiet lesson hidden beneath every meaningful experience. Not that certainty is impossible, but that truth is often spacious enough to include mystery without becoming less true. I've stopped seeing mystery as the absence of knowledge. Sometimes it's simply knowledge that hasn't finished revealing itself. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps wisdom begins the moment we stop demanding immediate clarity and instead become trustworthy enough to carry unanswered questions with patience. Because not every truth arrives fully formed. Some become visible only after we've learned how to see without insisting on immediate conclusions. Maybe that's what this journey has always been asking of me. Not to become someone who knows everything, but someone who remains open enough to keep learning, honest enough to keep changing, and quiet enough to recognize that the deepest transformations almost always begin before we have words for them.